sandstone hosted disseminated copper, secondary copper in this instance, malachite, within the oxide zone of a deposit in Kazakhstan. Copper mineralization within these reduced host rocks basically typically occurs as disseminations, replacements, and laminations, and then also importantly the byproducts, which are typically cobalt, very much in the case of the Central African copper belt, and silver as well, in the case of the Kalahari copper belt, the sedimentary copper basins in the US, the Belt Purcell Basin and the Mid-Continent Rift, as well as the Geosciences Basin in Kazakhstan that we'll have a closer look at later. So while stratigraphy provides the chemical trap, it does not explain why copper arrives there in the first place, and that transport problem is fundamentally a structural one. Okay, so just more on the deposit type, these deposits account for about 20% of global production, as shown in the green wedge there in the pie chart. The chart at the bottom is from Hitzman again, and shows the major sediment-hosted copper provinces over time. So off here on the right, it's basically one of the oldest sediment-hosted copper deposit or copper basins. That is the Uralkhan Basin in Russia, in Siberia. And then in the Mesoproterozoic, you've got the deposits within the US, Mid-Continent Rift and the Belt Purcell Basin. And then moving into the Neoproterozoic, obviously the broad zone there, the Kalahari, the Central African copper belt, being really prominent. And then in the Carboniferous, you've got the Geosciences deposits in Kazakhstan, and then some of the youngest ones, very prolific and well endowed, the Kupferschiefer in Europe, which is Permian in age. Importantly, these ages really are the host sequence. The absolute age of mineralization is a little bit more tricky, and can range from early diagenetic through to late diagenetic, all the way through to late copper remobilization during basin inversion. However, despite differences in age, host rock, and depositional environments, almost all of these deposits share a common feature, which is the point of this talk, which is long-lived structural pathways that basically control the fluid flow. Looking at a map of where these deposits occur, in gray you see there is the global distribution of all known sediment-hosted copper deposits, so they're pretty much widespread. However, the important metallogenic provinces, and that is where with deposits containing more than 1 million tons of copper metal, they're shown in the red symbols there, and with the Central African copper belt being the largest and highest grade sediment-hosted stratiform copper province, hosting over what some people have estimated as well over 115 million tons of contained copper. So the two case studies that we'll look at is one from the Central African copper belt and another one from the Geosciences Basin in Kazakhstan. Despite the differences in age, these metallogenic provinces share several key features, such as large, thick sedimentary basins that experience prolonged subsidence and burial. They all contain reduced lithologies, large-scale faults, long-lived structures that control fluid flow. Most of them also show evidence for structural inheritance from the basement, with pre-existing major faults controlling the basin geometry and sedimentation. And these structures are really important in that they can remain mechanically weak over geologic time and can be reactivated throughout the history of these basins. Crucially, all of the major deposits exhibit strong spatial relationships between copper mineralization and structural pathways, and they're not random occurrences within favorable stratigraphy. Instead, they form where basin and sub-basin fluid flow systems intersect with structural traps and conducive stratigraphy as all part of one big mineral system. Mineral provinces that lack the sort of structural organization, as it were, may contain widespread copper anomalies that lack or really host giant deposits. So collectively, the point to make is that both structure and stratigraphy control economic mineralization in these deposits. So yeah, why does structure matter so much? I think one of the first point is metal transport, which is really a limiting factor in forming economic deposits. The copper concentration in these basinal brines is typically very low, often measured in tens or hundreds parts per million. And to accumulate millions of tons of copper metal in an economic deposit obviously requires a significant amount or enormous volumes of fluid to pass through this sedimentary basin. So without structural pathways, basin-wide fluid flow would be inefficient and diffuse and resulting in only minor copper enrichment here and there. That's why faults and fracture networks really are critical in providing the necessary permeability, allowing fluids to move along key pathways. And this structural control is observed at various scales, with faults really providing the primary plumbing mechanism for the fluids. So initially, or first off, at a basin scale, faults control subsidence rates, sediment thickness, the development of pressure and thermal gradients that really help to drive fluid flow. And these major basin bounding faults also commonly the deepest and most persistent fluid pathways capable of tapping large crustal volumes for metals, which is a key point. Also importantly, our view on basin architecture has been greatly assisted since the mid-1970s with seismic surveys. There's an example on the top right there. From the Thayer Basin again in Kazakhstan, it clearly shows intrabasinal highs as well as a significant sort of paleo high here on the left, as well as sort of basin margin faults, intrabasinal faults, local sub-basin depot centers, and that sort of thing. That's all critical to the actual overall basin architecture. At the district scale, we have intrabasinal faults, transfer faults, interconnecting faults, and structures like relay ramps that subdivide these sedimentary basins into compartments. And you can imagine each of these compartments affects the local stratigraphy and permeability, the location of reduced horizons as redox traps. And shown there is just an example I've taken from the literature of other relay ramps. So you've got two normal faults, one shown in white here, another one along the base here, with a real good example of a relay ramp connecting those two normal faults. And these basin or sub-basin margin faults are typically normal faults. So you have structures like this that really help create or form part of the basin architecture and also allow for dilational sites and hence fluid movement. And then down to a deposit scale, where we have small scale faults and folds, structures like that that affect grade distribution, also basement topography that affect the distribution of grade and also the geometry of higher grade chutes. The example on the top right is from Garlic, way back 1972, and shows a cross-section in the Chambishi Basin on the Zambian copper belt, with the Chambishi deposit on the left, up there, and the Chambishi Southeast deposit over there, flanking either side of a paleo basement high, which in this case is a granite. This was a syndepositional high in that the football sandstones thin out, wedge out against this high on both sides, and in black there is your ore shale, or now known as the copper belt ore body member. That is your ore body. And that we have a lateral facies change to stromatolitic dolostone over the high. So that's how we know it's a center positional high that controlled sedimentation. And what we also see there, hopefully you can pick out, is sulfide zoning for more copper-rich, proximal to displacement high. This case dominated by baunite, moving out to chalcopyrite, and then ultimately into a pyrite zone. Shown below there is very much the same sort of area, and this is from Dave Silly in 2015, and it shows the same Chambishi southeast deposit as what we see there. This is a very prominent part of the Kafiri anticline, a large basement high, and this is a local basement high. I think pretty much the same one as you see at the top there. And I don't know if you can see, but this again shows with the isopac map the thinning of the football sandstones against the high, but really the standout is the copper mineralization that wraps around and flanks that basement high. So in this case, we're looking at the paleo high as a control on mineralization. As we noted in the beginning, structure is really an important aspect right through the sedimentary basin history. And what we often find is reactivation of structures later on under new stress regimes, for example, during basin inversion. And these structures can dramatically increase permeability, way of brecciation, fracturing, dilation, that sort of thing, allowing remobilization of copper and concentration of copper into structural sites, such as cleavage planes and fold closures. So this can obviously result, and does, in upgrading copper mineralization in the form of higher grade zones. The top right is a section from Sarah Jane Gill, who did a lot of work in Namibia on the Kalahari copper belt, and it basically shows the Dameron rift here, and then the adjacent subparallel Chobe rift, Hunty Chobe rift, which became the Kalahari copper belt. And the point of showing this here is really one of basin inversion and fold and thrust belt that's sort of self-vergent, that really, well, turned it into fold and thrust belt. The example at the bottom is from Wesley Hall, who also presented this at Akakmali Symposium. And what you see is an anticline here with the pink being also your basal red beds, which show the brittle fracturing in the crest of the hinge zone. And overlying that, shown in red, will be stacked copper-bearing veins, remobilized copper, high grade, almost as a suite of saddle reefs. So that's just an example of structures, late-stage structures influencing these types of deposits. Right, our first case study is from the Chu-Zarisu Basin, which is in south-central Kazakhstan. So there's an inset map on the right, and it just shows the outline of Kazakhstan. That is the basin, south-central part of Kazakhstan, and then Bernard here. To give you an idea of scale, this basin is from top to bottom about 700 kilometers and ranges from 200 to 250 kilometers in width. It is bound on both sides by these large crustal scale structures. In 2010, the USGS, in cooperation with the Center for Russian and Central Eurasian Mineral Studies, based out of the Natural History Museum in London, undertook a whole study of an assessment of the sandstone copper potential of this basin. And if you're interested, that's all published on the USGS site and makes for pretty interesting reading. This map is taken from that work and shows the basin as pretty much compartmentalized, with the various shades of blue there representing elevation at the base of the red bed sequence, which is basically the sequence that hosts the mineralization in the basin. And there are also major sort of intrabasinal faults that, over there, another one there, that separates basin highs from troughs or basin lows. And as you can imagine, a lot of those were active through sedimentation, with the result that, especially in a basin of this scale, that you end up with compartmentalization, which really affects the distribution of stratigraphy, the red beds, the reduced zones, and ultimately where copper ends up being deposited. The Thayer Basin, incidentally, is the third largest sediment-hosted copper province in the world after the Central African Copper Belt and the Kupferschiefer in Europe. Having said that, mining is, there are only two areas of mining, one at Zaman Aibak out here, and then more importantly, up here in the north, the Geosciences sub-basin. So just small areas that have been, where mining has been a focus. Part of the reason for that is the basin is fully exposed, mostly covered by younger sediments. So exploration has been hampered in that sense. However, this has recently changed, and just over the last few years, with the number of companies recognizing the sediment-hosted copper potential of this basin and having embarked on exploration programs covering fairly large tracts of ground. This basin, as a matter of interest, also hosts oil and gas accumulations, and as well as sandstone uranium deposits, which are down here in the southern part of the basin. This is also taken from the USGS publication in 2010. What's important is that although the basin hasn't seen much in the way of copper exploration, it has seen a lot of exploration for hydrocarbons. And what we see here, fairly extensive seismic lines, very on the scale, 700 kilometers from top to bottom. It's pretty much well covered with seismic lines, and all the black dots represent drill holes as well. So from a hydrocarbon point of view, the basin has been fairly well covered. That's obviously greatly assisted in our understanding of the basin architecture. Most of that work was done in the Soviet eras, very little done recently, until Mr. Madisheva et al. In 2023 studied the paleogeography of the basin and its relationship with the accumulation of hydrocarbons. So the map on the top right there is from Madisheva's work, and again shows the broad framework of the basin defined by troughs and sub-basin. But I've annotated on there, I think the troughs are in black font, if you can see that, and then the actual basin highs or uplifts are in blue. So really sort of compartmentalized, as we said previously. The section below is based, or it covers about 250 kilometers from left to right, and it's based on this seismic section down there in the southeastern part of the basin. And it shows up very nicely the internal structure, as it were, with sort of intrabasinal highs, a lot of faulting that extends pretty much all the way up through the sequence. In other words, faults that were active during deposition. The edge of the basin here, which is fairly steeply dipping. And then also, quite interestingly, these reverse faults here from the eastern side, and folds that are related to basin inversion. So taking a closer look at the structure of this basin, there were two episodes of folding, basically, resulting in this dome and basin interference pattern throughout the basin that has strongly influenced the movement of hydrocarbons as well as metamorphous brines. And this diagram is taken from Allen et al. In 2001, who, from a study immediately adjacent to the basin on the western side. But I think it would also illustrate very nicely the typical sort of structural framework within the Thayer Basin, which is two periods of folding. You have an east-northeast trending F1 event, and these are the axial planes for those F1 folds. And superimposed on that, almost orthogonally, is the F2 event, which is almost north-south. Those are the axial traces of the F2. So that really results in a sort of this typical egg box basin and dome sort of interference pattern that we see there. This folding, interestingly, is mostly pre-mineralization in that it is really, that intersecting geometry has controlled both the migration of hydrocarbons in the first instance and also metalliferous brines. And those hydrocarbons, and how do we know this? It's really looking at these F1 anticlines, which typically contain gray, reduced sandstone beds that were formed by hydrocarbons migrating into these anticlinal fold hinges. Copper mineralization also shows a spatial association, this fold pattern, with that sort of ground having been prepared through the migration of hydrocarbons, which creates these reduced zones within the sequence, which really become your redox boundaries for later metalliferous fluids. Okay, so some of the key controls sediment-hosted copper mineralization is basic from a stratigraphic point of view. First of all, we've got a thick wet bed sequence with permeable, reduced sandstone units and interbedded siltstone argillite oxidized beds that have acted as aquicludes, and we'll see a couple of photographs of that later on. Those, to a large extent, have controlled the lateral flow of hydrocarbon fluids and gases. As we said, the interference fold geometry has really facilitated migration in traffic of hydrocarbon gases, which have resulted in reduced beds, and yet they've become the redox traps for subsequent copper mineralization. Then I think we've already pointed out that there's a particular focus of fluid movement along the crests of these anticlinal structures and monocline structures. So some of these, as we'll see later on, can be very, very subtle actually, but have still resulted in focusing of the copper mineralization at the end of the day. Mineralization is also localized along basin and sub-basin margins and on the flanks of paleo highs, similar to what we saw an example from the Zambian copper belt. So this diagram on the right from Dublin in 1997 shows a paleo high either at the edge of the basin margin or a sub-basin margin, but I think it's just shown schematically to show a sub-basin high with this red bed sequence. So this is a thick red bed sequence, and fluids have moved up along this wedging out of these red beds against the paleo high, with hydrocarbon fluids moving out then laterally into these porous sandstone beds. So this contact here is really the contact between oxidized stratigraphy and reduced stratigraphy. But to just point out these hatched zones here, these thin hatched layers shown schematically here, these are these argillaceous red beds, which effectively were aquicludes and really limited the vertical migration of fluids in the basin. So a lot of the alteration and reduction we see is quite extensive in a lateral sense. And then shown in black here on actual schematically, copper deposits extending out along these reduced beds, with obviously a concentration closer to the contact with that basal paleo high. The type of mineralization in this basin, as we've said, is sandstone type, and it shares similarities with the Reddit subtype that you see in a lot of the deposits in the US. These deposits are typically lower grade than your reduced facies, like Zambian copper belt type deposits, with the result that your global average grade within this basin is just over 1%. To give you an idea of scale, the Zaman Ibat mine is an underground mine with copper mineralization along the crest of one of these monoclinal structures, quite an extensive east-northeast trending F1 anticline, where you have a lot of hydrocarbons moving into that, and then subsequently copper mineralization. So the 2013 This is from Geo 2013 resource figures for that deposit, 136 million tons, just over 1.5%, and almost 19 grams per ton silver. So a little bit higher grade than what you see up here, but these are the super large deposits in the Geosciences sub-basin. It's a group of deposits, but together collectively form one of the world's largest sandstone copper kind of interbasinal provinces. 2012 estimate of, I think, what would be like the remaining copper, 22 million tons, at an average grade of just around 1%. So the next slide is basically zooming in into this Geosciences sub-basin, right up at the top there. And that's what it looks like. So shown here, and this is all from this USGS publication, this is the northern margin of your main basin, and the Geosciences sub-basin is this outline over there. To give you an idea of scale, that is 10 kilometers. So it's essentially an embayment with this narrow sort of a neck, and then also to point out the folding here, because as we said before, it's really controlled the distribution of mineralization. You've got the solid lines here of the F1 anticlinal structures. Down there, there's a syncline going through here, and then these F2 cross folds. There's a really prominent one, the Geosciences syncline, which comes through here, and the actual mineralization is strongly associated with the interference pattern, particularly down here in right in the neck of this sub-basin, where you have an intersecting anticlinal syncline forming a kind of a saddle. So showing green outline here is the extent of the actual deposits at the Sub-Payev ore field. There's two ore fields at Sub-Payev, this one down here. There's a Landy ore field, there's all the rest up here. But that is all mineralized, and you're basically looking at a mineralized system covering about 120 square kilometers, so pretty extensive. And then by some accounts, mining has been carried on intermittently since almost 1500 BC, which is a pretty long time, but over the last 100 years, almost continuously. And then just to point out some of these other basins here, or deposits that we shown in these green polygons, you'll notice that they are strongly controlled or spatially associated with the sub-basin margins, and that's where most of the mineralization is located there. If we look at the stratigraphy, and this is quite interesting, not to pay too much attention to this strat column on the left, but that's basically the entire sedimentary sequence. The mineralized part of that is this red bed sequence kind of in the middle here, and that's just blown up on the right there. And that vertical extends to about 700-800 meters. And it's made up of the Tasbelak subgroup and the Geosciences subgroup. So those are all red beds, or they were red beds before they were altered. And what we see, here's about 10 sedimentary cycles, each one of these here, that each contain between 3 to 5 mineralized zones, up to 5 meters thickness. So the color coding here, this first column here on the left is basically rock color, and you'll see in the photograph next it's very much almost a layer cake, red gray, sort of a layer cake appearance. And on the right is a lithology, with the green being these oxidized shales or apicludes, and then the yellow being sandstone. So it's probably hard to see, but on the right here, these are the different ore bodies, and they're all numbered and well known and correlated by that numbering. But the interesting thing to point out is that each copper mineralized zone is related to a gray unit. In other words, a reduced unit with the mineralization really focused towards the base of that reduced sandstone unit. And then in between each of those, you've got a kind of a seal, as it were, these oxidized shales, large rocks that inhibited fluid movement vertically. So just to show you what that looks like in exposure, hopefully that's not too dark, but it's a side wall of an old open pit in that Geosciences area, and you can see the sort of layer cake, red, gray. So the actual copper mineralization is entirely restricted to these gray reduced units. There's very little mineralization in the oxidized red layers. If we look further at the distribution of mineralization, this is a section sort of across that basin from south to north. So you're looking at the F1 gold axis. You can see these are anticlinal or monoclinal structures that are pretty undramatic. They're fairly subtle, some of them, but nonetheless they've controlled the distribution of copper mineralization, which is shown here in the pink. So you use your imagination. There's accumulation of copper towards the flanks of these sort of monoclinal or antiformal structures, and as well as along on the crests. And this is in almost like a cross-section perspective. You have to look in plan view. Each of these layers is quite more extensive sort of into the screen. So their actual geometry of the mineralized layers is very much strongly controlled by this sort of fold pattern. And just shown at the bottom, there's not quite the same section from that, the published one, but it shows pretty similar sort of in real life what that looks like. You can see these gray beds here. It's not exactly planar. You have the sort of gentle warps and flexures, and although they're subtle, they have controlled to a large extent where the copper is located. To give you an idea of scale, that section at the top there is about 350, 400 meters of vertical thickness. And then just lastly, to show you what the mineralization looks like, on the right there, we had that photograph right in one of the intro slides, and that's the oxidized mineralization, obviously on the sides of one of these open pits. And you can see, just to point out, these sort of red, argillaceous red beds down here, and the copper very much confined to the gray reduced sandstone above that, particularly towards the base. So if we have a look, these photographs were taken underground. What does it look like underground? It's a lot more difficult to see. So this is one of these gray, planar bedded sandstone units that's been reduced. And believe it or not, there's a fair amount of disseminated bornite in that. But the reason I've included this photograph is that just around the corner from that one on the left is a zone of veining where bornite has moved into the vein. So it's a little bit more clear to see the bornite in these cross-cutting veins. Right. The second case study is from the Zambian copper belt, or the Congolese copper belt. But just to briefly talk about the Central African copper belt as a whole, it is the world's largest and highest grade sediment-hosted copper province, as we said in the outset, containing well over 100 million tons, 150 million tons of copper metal. And that is all hosted in the Katangan Rift Basin, which developed over Mesopotamia Proterozoic basement, and within Zambia and the DRC. So the border between Zambia and DRC is basically that line over there. And what you had is like post-deposition, lithilian orogeny, basin inversion with divergence towards the northeast, and the formation of or development of several structural zones. There's 4 or 5 of them. But just to point out, down here is your classic sort of on the bottom right, the classic Zambian copper belt type autochthonous or in situ deposits that have been strongly influenced by various factors, including basement highs, as we saw at Chambishi. And then you have the Domes region out here, where I think about 70 to 80% of Zambian copper production comes from these days. We've got these super large deposits at Kansanshi, Lumwana, Sentinel, that are producing the bulk of Zambian copper. Slightly different style. That's hosted in the basal of the Titanian sequence overlying these domes, but also extends into the upper basement contact zone as well, as is the case at Sentinel, or certainly in the Mombezi dome in a project that we recently worked on. And then we have this big sort of envelope here, which is your external fold and thrust belt. Those are your typical deposits in the DRC, where that mineralization is mostly hosted in rafted megabreccias that have been really moved by salt tectonics. So a different style of mineralization altogether. We won't be looking at that, but what we will be looking at is briefly is Kamoa Kakula, which is just to the immediate west of that fold, external fold and thrust belt. It's located in the so-called Western Foreland region. And the deposits here at Kamoa Kakula are again autochthonous, they're in situ, and share a lot of similarities with the Zambian type deposits. So if we have a look at the stratigraphy again, this is the entire strat column on the left-hand side. Most of the mineralization, but all of it in Zambia and within that external fold and thrust belt is hosted in these rocks down here, specifically in the mines subgroup. But in the Kamoa Kakula area, this part of the stratigraphy wasn't deposited. So what you had is an expanding basin during deposition, and the upper parts of the stratigraphy sort of were deposited directly onto basement in that Western Foreland region. So you have a kind of an abbreviated stratigraphy at Kamoa Kakula, certainly with some underlying red beds at the top part of the row. All the rest is missing. It wasn't deposited. And with the mineralization hosted in this grand conglomerate unit, which is basically the first reduced horizon you come to in that part of the basin. And it's reduced, it contains carbonaceous material, power, sort of thing. So that is the host to the mineralization there at Kamoa. And then looking at the geology, this is the geological map from Geo. There are a couple of things to point out. Well, first to state that Kamoa was discovered in 2008 under Kalahari Group cover, completely blind. This structure here, this over there, is basically the western margin of that extensive arcuate external fold and thrust belt, which extends right through the DRC, southern part of the DRC. And for a long time, it was considered that the actual copper belt ended about here. This is the Colwezi map, which contains a whole group of these rafted mines group fragments, mineralized fragments. And so that's where for a long time everybody thought that's where things end, because this is all under Kalahari Group cover. But exploration by Ivory Platts in 2008 ended up discovering this huge deposit, Kamoa, and then subsequently Kakula. To give you an idea of size, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these numbers. 2023 resource estimate, that's just a measured and indicated, and a 1% copper cutoff was almost 1.4 billion tons, at 2.7% copper, almost 38 million tons of metal. And then there's an inferred resource base on top of that as well. In this map by Geo, and this has been stripped of the cover, Kalahari cover, you see outlined here in this red sort of polygon, and down here is the surface projection of the mineral resource back in 2019. For the 2023, I haven't stated here, I think the 2023 resource estimate covers a footprint of about 75 square kilometers. So super extensive footprint to the system. What is critical from a structural point of view is this northeast trending basement high, which sort of dips or plunges, I should say, towards the southwest, but it is exposed up here as a Sanila block. There's a Papari aged basement rocks, that then plunge below or undercover, under the Katangan sedimentary rocks. Just to point out, there are two very important domal structures here, the Kamoa Dome and the Makula Dome, and a couple of smaller ones down here that are strongly influenced copper mineralization at these deposits. And that again, the reason why they're domes, again, you're getting an interference type pattern that is formed this domal geometry. And you can see that the mineralization footprint really wraps around these domes to a large extent. If we look at a section, and this section is the Kamoa, so basically like that. And this was published by Ivanhoe Mines in 2014, but it illustrates quite nicely the distribution mineralization relative to structure and paleotopography. And what you see here, first of all, in blue, your basal red beds, the Rodal and Washia subgroup, and this sort of paleotopography that you have here, and it's influenced by these basement domes at depth. And then overlying that is your grain conglomerate, and shown in red here on these drill holes is the copper mineralization, which is pretty much bottom loaded, so highest grades at the base, particularly in where it's really proximal to this the red bed contact. So mineralization is better developed along the edges of these structural highs. And also what we see, another important point, that last one there, is variations in stratigraphic thickness reflect basic controlling structures active during sedimentation. And we'll talk more about that right now. Frank Tweety, who worked for Ivanhoe Mines, did an MSc study in the stratigraphic, the finer controls of stratigraphy and structure in mineralization at this deposit or deposits. And what he looked at was this. So here again, you've got the Kamoa Dome and the Makula Dome down here, and shown in these warm colors, basically, or copper, 80% copper accumulation rather, and you can see it's pretty much widespread. But what we want to focus on here is the concentration of copper accumulation along the structure. So while this basement high is north-northeast trending, you have what's known as the Mapaku fault, which is being interpreted by Frank as a sedimentary fault, in that you have variations in stratigraphic thickness on either side of that, and very much a spatial correlation of higher copper concentrations along that fault. So he looked at drill holes sort of close to this Mapaku fault, and these are examples that he published in 2019 in Journal of African Earth Sciences, showing, and these are all pieces of core to get an idea of the scale, soft sediment deformation and slumping. And then these two photos here are essentially like vertical drill holes, and that is bedding. So you can see it's almost vertical, or at least very steep bedding, micro faulting in there, incipient faulting, got a bornite in here, I'm not sure if you can see that, and then this layer here as well. And then the two examples on the right are just good examples of sort of micro incipient faulting, indicating proximity to what's being interpreted as sedimentary growth faults related to this major structure here. So this is again from Frank's work, and it's a presentation he gave at that Milani Symposium in 2020. So we've seen at a core scale, evidence on a core scale, looking underground, and this on the top right, if I remember correctly, is about 2 meters from left to right, and shows bedding steepening from around 27 degrees to almost 50 degrees. That's a super steepening you see there, again interpreted as a result of proximity to one of these sedimentary growth faults, where you have, we can expect to find and do have seismic instability and this sort of slumping, soft sediment deformation. And then just the bottom photo is, I think, taken from close to this one here. This is from the sidewall. This is in the development phase, and he's annotated the steep bedding down here. And all of this is really high-grade concentrated chalcocite mineralization within this zone of steep bedding, again interpreted to be close to one of these sedimentary growth faults that again would have been a conduit potentially for fluid migration. So this is the second last slide, but I had to include this because it's just so it's so cool, really. And this is from the fish tire deposit in Zambia, which is sort of around the corner from the southern extent of the Zambian copper belt itself. And it sits in a small satellite basin. It has 55 million tons, just over 1% copper. It's 2014 estimate. But the interesting thing is it's hosted in the same stratigraphy as Kamoa-Kakula, which is a grand conglomerate. But the difference here is that these units were deposited directly onto basement, paleoproterozoic schists, metasediments. But what you see, these basin margin faults and copper mineralization very strongly correlate with those faults. So first of all, the faults have also have affected the stratigraphic thickness, with these thicker zones and thinning of sediments, thickness out away from those faults. So again, sort of sedimentary growth faults, as it were. But in terms of the mineralization, you've got an oxide, a high-grade sort of oxide supergene capped to this, and then underlying that, these are the hypogene zones, this sort of Christmas tree type sulfide hypogene mineralization directly associated with those faults, and showing a vertical and lateral zoning. So the purple is bornite, the high-grade copper, extending laterally into yellow, all these sort of chocolate pyrite zones, and then into pyrite from a more distal point of view. So again, demonstrating like fluid movement up along these basin margin structures, and then laterally is sort of really porous, reduced zones within the grand conglomerate. So just in summary, really, and this is the last slide, sediment-hosted copper deposits are really dynamic hydrothermal systems, controlled to a large extent by structure, which is really the engine that transports, focuses, and traps copper in combination with the right stratigraphy, of course, but operating from a basin scale right down to the deposit scale and even down to an intra-deposit scale, as we saw in some of those photographs of core and from underground. So some of the other points, stratigraphy, geochemistry, and redox conditions are necessary, but don't in themselves explain the formation of, particularly the giant ore deposits. Tonnage and grade are directly linked to the structural architecture, as hopefully I've been able to demonstrate. In that structure really ends up controlling, particularly not only your deposits, but some of the higher grade zones within those deposits, which is really the next point. Multi-phase deformation, often during basin inversion, has really enhances mineralization in many cases. And the key takeaway point really is that while stratigraphy hosts mineralization, structure largely dictates or controls where it ends up at the end of the day. So that is the last slide. Thank you for your attention, and welcome any questions or comments.
So anyone has any questions?
Thank you, Mike. That was super interesting.
the atmosphere. So I think that's one aspect in terms of why you don't find them older than that. Yeah, that's my first off. I'm sure Sharad would be able to comment on that as well. But yeah, that's my first thoughts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The rise of an oxygenated atmosphere and evaporites as well, sulfate evaporites, some of the major components in styrofoam sediment-hosted copper deposits. And in fact, Udakan is not the only Leopoldo-Zaic copper district. The Mobandi copper belt, on which I did my PhD, the whole copper belt is also Paleopolyzoic. And there are also other deposits elsewhere in the world. In northern Norway, the Repparfjord deposits in Michigan as well, that are in the Konrad dolomite, which are also 2 billion years in age. And I guess you require all the things like major evaporite basins, which probably weren't, present or at the time. But I've got a question for Michael, or rather a comment. More than 40 years ago, I shared an office with Mike Robertson downstairs when I was doing my PhD. And around that time, my supervisor was Ken Maiden, and we published together almost one of my very first papers. It had the exact same title as your talk, Structural Controls on Sediment-Hosted Cover Deposits. And yeah, the same things that you've outlined, the controls on basin architecture by faults is one of the major things that controls the ingress of fluids, and also inversion of these faults later on as fluid pathways and so on. So it's a well-known thing. What we've highlighted in Jessica's gun are the idea that there's a hydrocarbon basin, and that it's pre-prepared from say hydrocarbon migration into these sandstones and reduce them, and then a later generation of hydrothermal fluids carrying copper could have come into these sandstones and be reduced. And in fact, I just worked recently on an exact similar deposit, but much smaller scale in Morocco, which is exactly that. It's a structurally controlled fold in which there was hydrocarbons, and then came hydrothermal copper. Or in fact, it was the other way around. There was copper, there were fluids that were trapped under this, and then at a later stage during basin inversion, hydrocarbons came from an underlying sedimentary basin and reacted with those and basically reduced them just under this one particular structure. So that's a common feature as well, hydrocarbons and copper mineralization.
Yeah, thanks, Sharad. I think it's particularly interesting in the case of that Tree-Sericea basin. If it wasn't for the that detailed hydrocarbon exploration, would be starting from pretty much almost ground zero in terms of exploration within that huge basin. So all that seismic data, and it's all meticulous Soviet work that was done, I think is proving very useful now, and a great starting point for the companies that are now operating there and drilling deep stratigraphic holes to figure out the stratigraphy and the basin architecture with the view, obviously, of exploration targeting.
So is there a rush now to other hydrocarbon basins to look for copper? I mean, that data is often available. The seismic data, are people looking in other places for that kind of scenario?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm sure there are. I must admit, I'm more familiar with so I visited this basin a couple of years ago. I'm much more familiar with the reduced species carbonaceous shale hosted systems. So this is super interesting for me, and I think I'm not aware of sort of a global scale how much exploration has been focused on this. And the sandstone type hydrocarbon associated reduced basins, but that's an interesting point.
May I just jump in? Gregor Borg here. Thanks, Mike, for your fantastic talk. And the last question that came out, I think it's a new phenomenon for the last 5, probably not more years, that hydrocarbon geologists and metal geologists are starting to talk to each other, because there's a lot of overlap. There are other examples when you go to Colorado and Utah, where you have these huge scenic cliffs where you can see bleaching from hydrocarbon-bearing fluids going up and bleaching the rocks. And there you go to the Keshen Basin, for example, you also have the same fluids that have moved hydrocarbons and metals. The other place where that is the case is where I've been recently working in for the last couple of years is in Ecuador. And the Cutucu Basin there on the eastern side of the Andes is an area that has been explored for oil and gas for a long time. And now they're realizing that you've got sediment-hosted copper in the area as well. I just have one question, Mike. You were mentioning for Kazakhstan that you find a proportional relationship between fault density and copper mineralization. On some scales, I see the same. I would wholeheartedly agree when it comes down to the ore body dimension. At the same time, I feel from my experience that you could have a situation where you get a dispersal of fluids and a dilution by structure. If you look at along the Kalahari Copper Belt, which I worked on quite for a long time, you have two portions, the one in the west at the Kleinaup mine, which is a very, very small one, but it's quite significant for their understanding. And you basically have the area in Botswana, where you, in the one case in Botswana, have much more open folding. You don't really have such a thrust belt. Then you go into the eastern portion between Rehoboth and the Namibian-Botswana border, where everything is chopped to pieces. You do have volcanics, you do have the sediments, you do get volcanic-hosted copper at Dordebis, but you don't get substantial size of ore bodies. And my feeling is this is due to very, very dense thrusting and too much faulting. And when you go to the west to Kleinaup, you are behind the buttress of the Rehoboth inlier. So any comment on that?
Thanks, Gregor. That's certainly an interesting point. Thanks for the comment. I guess, yeah, look, the point that I was trying to make, the Geosciences Basin is a direct correlation with copper concentration and that's with fault intensity. But I can also imagine that if you've got too much structure and not enough perhaps stratigraphic traps, that you can actually have structure flushing the system, and fluids moving right through without being concentrated. So that's an interesting point you made. Thank you.
Sure. Excellent talk. Thank you.
Do we have any questions in the room? Okay, so I have a question. So you did say that the structures are divided into compartments. Is there any relationship between these compartments and the grade of copper? If you could touch upon that.
Yeah, I think it's probably on a case-by-case basis within these, because you can imagine that each of these sort of structural compartments, and particularly towards the in the early stages of these rift basins, you have it doesn't all just form at once. So you end up with these incipient rifting and little sub-basins that then gradually coalesce and get covered with more and more sediment later on. So I think it's very much a case-by-case basis for each sub-basin or compartment, we call it that, as to where your stratigraphy and how that controls stratigraphy. If you've got the right red beds or the right aquifer, as the red beds are, you have the right reductant being deposited there or not, and that sort of thing. So I don't think there's any kind of, and from my point of view, any rule in terms of compartments or sub-basins and grade. I think one would need to look at them each on an individual basis. Yes.
So my question is a bit simple. Just from what you've been explaining, understand, is there a reason why south of the domes region, we don't get any major endowments of copper, south and southeast of the dome, even though we do have some copper sediments.
Yeah, I think the domes have just helped bring things closer to surface. I think as you go towards the south, you still have copper in the system in a broad sense within the southern part of the Italian Basin, but in a different style. I mean, you look at things like at Mumbo area, the Katumba deposit, where your copper is more in sort of an IOCG type deposit setting. So, and then you get deposits like Kalengwa that are kind of like supergene. But yeah, I mean, there is copper south of the domes region. It's just in a different, yeah, I think you're getting into, the basin becomes really thick, and you're looking at the upper part of the stratigraphy, basically the Kundalungu. So you're quite a way up from, you know, from your sort of Rhone stratigraphy, which would be quite, you know, at depth, as it were. But yeah, there's copper there, just in a different kind of deposit style.
Do we have any other questions? Anyone online?
Mike? James McMaster here. Thanks for a great talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
James.
yeah.
Yeah, Mike, just returning to that hydrocarbon theme. From memory, there was some research done by Annals way back on the Mufulira deposit, so other side the Kafue anticline, not exactly analogous to the, you know, the ore shale type, but from memory, I think that hydrocarbons were put forward as a reductant in these more aeronitic units on that side of the Kafue anticline. And I also recall, you know, these football type deposits being linked to hydrocarbon trapped under the ore shale, in fact, as a reductant. So mobile reductants potentially in the Zambian copper belt as well.
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, I actually, when we were working up there, well, with you, I certainly recall hydrocarbons being mentioned. We didn't see any examples in core. Just, I wouldn't have much of an idea as to how prevalent they are. But that's a very good point you raised. There are definitely mentions of or cases of hydrocarbons in on the Zambian copper belt as well. But Sharad wants to comment on that.
Question of hydrocarbons, I want to add that, you know, the hydrocarbons don't necessarily have to come from a distant source. In fact, many of the shales that host these Taliban copper deposits, like the Kufishifa, it's postulated that the hydrocarbons that were maybe present in the footwall red beds in the so-called ice league in this actually derived from the Kufishifa itself. And I've actually seen hydrocarbons underground at the White Pine deposit, which is shale hosted, and there's actually hydrocarbons seeping out of the shale today. You can actually go underground and get seeps of hydrocarbons coming out of those black shales. So they're very, very organic rich shales, and they could have produced a lot of the hydrocarbons or the reduced beds underneath, which are mineralized, the sandstone hosted units.
Thanks, Sharad. Great comment.
Okay. So we've come to the end of the talk. Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for the talk, and thank you all for attending.
Hello, sorry, I'm a bit late. May I ask you one question, Mike?
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. So I understand that there are a lot of different types of deposits within that basins. So you mentioned sedimentary copper mineralization. What was it introduced into soft sediment, or rather after it has been solidified? And are there any examples of precipitation from bottom brines like a SEDEX type?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. Would you mind just repeating what?
So I just I want to ask you about how it was the mineralization was introduced into the sediments. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I don't see any sort of like parallels with SEDEX or evidence for SEDEX as part of these systems. But yeah, I mean, the point for the idea throughout this talk was really that the fluids are being mobilized through structures, through faults, and then obviously in porous sedimentary beds as well. That's where your fluid is really moving through. And some of the examples we showed there from Kamoa, you mentioned the soft sediment slumping, and I think really is a good example of sedimentation happening or the time is active faulting and instability within that part of the basin, where you have, I guess, like local seismic events that then induce the slumping, soft sediment deformation, and then your mineralizing fluid probably coming along a bit later, I guess, into those fluids. But yeah, that's my comment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right, just once again, Mike, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who's joined. That was great. And we really appreciate Mike's been lecturing the whole day to the MSc Economic Geology class and now has given this lecture. So thank you.